Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. This week's video is something that is a little bit different than what I normally do. Oftentimes I talk about the writing or the behind the scenes of certain TV shows and video games. And as you guys know, my ultimate goal is to go into writing films and working on film. So naturally I know a lot about plot structure, things like that, and I did a very deep dive into the plot structure of the first 2 episodes of The Last of Us Season 2. And I've gotten comments and suggestions that people would like to see me talk about writing in a similar way more often. So I'm trying my hand at a movie review. Obviously, the biggest release and the release that I think my fan base would be the most interested in hearing about is 28 Years Later, the long-awaited sequel to 28 Weeks Later, even though most call it a more direct sequel to 28 Days Later. Either way, it is a movie that redefined zombie movies once again. It was the first time we really saw fast zombies. It also introduced the idea that the zombies were just infected and not necessarily undead like in previous iterations. And especially with the warm response to my previous Project Zomboid videos as well as my Walking Dead videos, I figured this would be the best movie to try my hand at a review with. So let's get into my review of 28 Years Later. The way I'm going to structure this review is first I'll talk about the visuals, then I'll talk about the world, I'll touch on the infected, then I'll move on to the story and then the themes, and then finally we will discuss that ending, because if you have seen this movie, oh my god, that ending certainly... You'll certainly have an opinion about that ending. Going forward, spoiler warning for 28 Years Later. While I won't be going over the story beat by beat like a summary, I will be discussing details from the story and the fate of certain characters, so watch at your own risk. I would really just recommend going to see the movie, because it was definitely an experience that I would recommend seeing in the theater. So first, let's start with the visuals. The first thing I noticed is that the shots are very intentional, and each of them has something to say. I know a lot of people like to say that every shot in your movie should be a painting, and that's not necessarily the case in this movie. However, these shots are very intentional. And what I mean by intentional is that the framing, the position of the characters, the background scene, as well as the flow of the action was all very well thought out. There's obviously very generic ways to film a conversation. You know, you just have the 2 cameras set up, you cut back and forth, and then you have your master shot. However, in this film, that's not the case. They are very creative in how they show even basic interactions. And in those conversations, they all felt very intimate. The tone of the conversations themselves was communicated very well visually just through the framing. The scene where Spike is talking to Eric and Eric shows him the photo of his fiancée, and there's that really funny exchange there. The camera work is done in a way that it almost feels, one of my friends even compared it to a comedy like The Office, the way the camera, instead of just being stationary, moved to show, kind of flip back and forth in a single shot rather than cutting a lot. I really liked that. And it kind of played up some of the very bleak and very British comedy that is in this movie. This is one of those movies that the conversations, it feels like you are there with the characters. The framing is very tight, it's very close, and you feel like you're sitting down with these characters, whether they're in the field, whether they're hiding out somewhere. It all really immerses you into the story, which also helps when it comes to the action. The action of 28 days, 28 weeks, and 28 years is all very hectic. It feels like the camera is constantly moving. It's all very handheld, very run-and-gun style of filmmaking. They also use what I'm assuming is a camera rig similar to what was used in The Matrix to get the bullet time thing, but it's for when the infected gets shot. You kind of get this sort of pan around and you see the arrow go through in the blood. It's really cool. But all that to say about the action being so hectic, it's still very easy to follow the action. It's still very digestible. I understand what is going on, who is where, and where these characters are in relation to the threat that they are facing. So I have to give them props for that, because a lot of movies fall into the trap of just thinking that shaky cam makes the scene so intense, and then it ultimately feels like I can't understand what's going on in the scene, despite how well the choreographing of the fight may or may not be. Apparently some if not all, of this movie was like shot on an iPhone. I personally don't know how true that is, but I'm willing to bet it's like, sure, yeah, there's an iPhone in there, but like it's an iPhone with a bajillion different camera attachments to it. I don't really like when movies try to use that as a sort of marketing thing, because yeah, sure, it is technically, but we're not talking about the $3,000 rig that it's attached to, you know what I mean? Next, we're going to discuss the world and the overall setting of 28 Years Later. Now, 28 Days Later is a lot of people's favorite zombie film, and it is no doubt an iconic movie, both of them 28 Weeks as well, despite 28 Weeks not being as well loved or well known as the first one. I still think both of them are very, very good. And I think a lot of people hold them near and dear to their heart. So it's very important to consider, how do we evolve this world 28 years removed from the first movie? And I think they do it in a very, very successful way. I feel like the world grew in a very realistic way. The plant life and the deterioration of the old world, I guess you could say, looks really, really good and feels a lot more realistic than some other shows. The village that Spike is from feels very lived in and very realistic, and I love the way that their society works. The way that the village's society works feels very real, and the individual jobs, the sort of culture of this island of people feels very, very realistic. That's something I have to really give them when it comes to the world as well as other aspects of this movie. Because it's so far removed from the first one, it feels very in line with it despite the passage of time. While it's very grim, I think the idea of the world sort of just cordoning off Britain and calling it a day is actually fairly realistic. I think that it's grim, but real, and I actually really enjoy that the virus itself is sort of contained to this area. I feel like a lot of movies kind of lose themselves when they try to say, oh, it's gone global, and we're gonna, you have Fear the Walking Dead that shows all these different places, and now you've got Daryl Dixon is in France for whatever reason. 28 years later, keeping it grounded within the British Isles makes a lot of sense. The physical sets themselves were built very, very well. There was a clear attention to detail with every little thing within these sets. Whether it's an abandoned building that they're staying in or Spike's village, it's clear that so much care was put into this. And I love seeing physical sets because it makes everything just feel more real. And I think that the use of CGI being somewhat sparing, obviously it's there. Let's not pretend that everything they did here was in camera, but I think the sparing use of it and the use of it to stylize the movie worked really, really well in sort of aiding the feel of the world. The nights being so bright because, hey, the entire British Isles doesn't have light anymore, so naturally you're going to see these insane constellations, and, obviously it's a little difficult to do that fully practically and in camera. But overall, I think the world of the movie was very, very well done. Next, we're going to talk about the infected. Oddly enough, the infected reminded me of the people from Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, where the people have now sort of devolved into these cavemen type creatures. Obviously, it's very, very different because the infected in this movie are, hyper violent, and obviously it's a little different. Those movies are very, very different, but just, I don't know why, I kind of drew a connection there. While obviously surviving with a mixture of Ebola and whatever else is in the rage virus for that long is unrealistic. I mean, their insides would be jelly by the time that like a few weeks pass. I don't think they'd even make it 28 weeks. So despite some of the, less realistic aspects of it, I think the fact that they take the time to show the infected hunting other animals and eating things like insects and worms, I think that attention to detail alone sort of helps to bridge the gap in my mind of what is possible with this virus. Because obviously we have to remember that these are infected, not undead zombies, similar to something like The Last of Us. Also, I know, as dumb as it sounds, the detail of them not having clothes, it might seem odd to the uninitiated, but clothing actually has a very, very short, lifespan when unprotected from the elements. Things like t-shirts and jeans and whatnot, unless they're taken care of, will basically disintegrate after a few decades. So for them to be completely naked running around, isn't as weird as you might think. It's not really a weird choice. I believe even The Last of Us 2 started to lean into that with certain infected. I also think introducing the different types of infected was very smart. I think having the sort of the fat ones who crawl on the ground and the runners and the alpha, I think that does a great job of showing us that even on a basic level, the infected are evolving and changing due to their environment. I think the alpha infected is the best change / addition to the lore of the infected in 28 years later. When you have basically a subspecies of human that's constantly pumped up on adrenaline and is constantly firing at insane rates, it makes sense that eventually when they breed, you would get these insanely tall, insanely hyper-masculine creatures. And I also think that the alpha does a great job of solidifying one of the themes of the movie, which we will circle back to. Also, I think the idea of them breeding makes a lot of sense, and the pregnancy scene, while very odd, was very sincere and sort of showed that there is humanity within the infect. Now we're going to talk about the story, and I have no issues with the story, really, beyond a few nitpicky things. And obviously this is kind of barring the ending. The ending I have a lot to say about, and I'm sure you do too, but we will circle back to that. But I will say that the first act was by far the most enjoyable. I think seeing Spike and his father going around on the mainland was very, very well done. I think the challenges and the things that Spike has to face and do when he's with his father in this early part of the film, it feels very real, especially to those of us who may have grown up hunting or dealing with animals on a farm, things like that. It felt very real. Obviously, it's a exaggerated version of that because these are people, but still I thought those challenges and the interactions and the lessons between Spike and his father felt very grounded, and obviously with that extreme element of it being infected. I think a lot of people didn't expect the movie to go the direction it did, which it became a lot more contemplative as time went on. It started with, heart-pounding, fast action, constant, and then it kind of slows down and it wants you to think a little more and contemplate what it means to live and death and all those things. Like I said, we'll touch back on theme later. But I think this is where some people got caught off guard because the advertisements do make it look like Aaron Taylor Johnson is the main character of the movie when he most certainly is not. It is much more about Spike and his relationship with his mom. Me personally, I went in without seeing any of the trailers. I went in as blind as I possibly could, despite some of the little ads you might see on like Instagram or TikTok or whatever. While at first the idea of Spike taking his mom to a doctor is sort of odd to me, I actually did wind up really enjoying it because of where that story took us. Initially, though, I was kind of resistant to it. I was like, really? This is the way we're going? But I kept my mind open and I wound up really, really enjoying it. I think side characters like Eric and the doctor are fantastic. The performances themselves are great. They each serve different purposes within the story, and they each do it perfectly, to a T. I think they were great additions to the world. And it also didn't feel overcrowded. This is a very intimate movie. It has very few characters that really talk to each other that we really spend time with. So I'm glad they didn't go overboard with introducing new characters and new plot lines. It felt very, very concentrated, and I liked that. The other thing I like with the Doctor character in particular is that it shows that there's still genuine people out there. While he may not be the most sane person on the planet, he is a very real and genuine human being who believes he's doing the best thing he can to honor those who have passed. And I think that's a great thing to show when 28 weeks, 28 days tends to be a much more pessimistic series. With the exception of characters like Jeremy Renner's NATO officer within the second movie, he has one of the only heroic deaths in the entire series, to be honest. And finally, of course, the scene with the mom at the end when she sort of accepts her fate and we get that montage, and I think that was just handled so well, and it admittedly made me tear up in the theater. And I know my friends who I was with were also in tears because of that scene. It was just very well done. And also, speaking of performances, I don't want to shy away from Spike. His performance, especially for someone who I believe was 13 at the time of filming, was fantastic. And he's just another example of how we need to hold child actors to a higher standard. We can't just say, oh, he's a kid, that means it's okay if he's a bad actor, because he was fantastic. He showed a lot of depth, a lot of humanity to it. And it certainly helped that a lot of the things in the movie were practical, so he was able to react and give a genuine reaction to those things. It was fantastic. Next, we're going to get into themes, and this is going to be a little more subjective from me and what I took away from the movie. In the first act, would cut to videos and images from other films, medieval films, as well as war film. And while it was a little heavy-handed, I guess you could say, I think it worked. The style of filmmaking in this movie is very hectic. It's very in-your-face, show thing for a second, and, you take away what you do from it. And so, while at first I thought it was heavy-handed, upon thinking about it, it does fit within the style of this movie, so I really don't have any complaints with it. And I'm sure it was intentional, but I found myself thinking of movies like All Quiet on the Western Front, among other sort of anti-war war movies. And this theme of war and trying to prove yourself as a man and how you can never really come home from war, similar to what is discussed in All Quiet on the Western Front, is pretty clearly stated by Eric's character when he's discussing his friend who's a delivery driver and how, no, you need to do something that matters with your life, like join the military. And then he winds up being abandoned by that military on Death Island, basically. And it shows that in the end, it's not worth it. That is not the way that you become valuable to your society or prove yourself as a man. And that's obviously meant to parallel Spike and also our current day, like what we deal with currently in the world when it comes to combat and bickering over resources. I do think there is a deeper theme here about masculinity and what it means to be a man. First and foremost, the war themes and the themes of going off to war are inherently a masculine thing. Historically, the people who have fought in wars tend to be men, and that's not discrediting any of the women in service that we have currently, or women who have served in the past. I'm just discussing in a much more general sense. But like I said, it goes hand in hand with what it means to be a man. Spike is a very caring and compassionate person, and this is something that sort of conflicts directly with his father, who is a lot more no-nonsense, and we see this perfectly illustrated when they first both go out into the world together. His father kind of finds this troubling and wants him to man up, essentially, and be able to do what he thinks he should be able to do. And this is further illustrated by when they come back, his father is making up stories about how brave and how strong Spike was, when in reality, he was just a scared kid. Similar to how many people in World War I, World War II, and basically every war that humanity has ever fought have been. And that at the end of the day, these are just boys and young men being put in an environment where they're forced to do horrible things. But when they come back, they're forced to sort of perpetuate that myth of honor among men at war. I just thought it was a very well done way to do it. And using this sort of apocalyptic setting for it, I thought was very, very well done. Not only that, but coming back to the Alpha and its appendage, I guess, is the YouTube friendly way to say it. That's obviously another intentional thing. The action movie Predator from the 80s with Arnold Schwarzenegger and all these really big buff guys was actually very interestingly a criticism of the stereotype of masculinity and being hyper-masculine. That's why you have all these guys with their big old muscles, and then you have this creature also has big old muscles, also has big old guns. It was meant to be intimidating and also be hyper-masculine and show it cutting down these men, and it was meant to sort of scare them, I guess you could say. But a connection between that and this movie would be that I think there's a similar intention with the alphas in this movie. That it's meant to be as hyper-masculine in every way as possible to show how primal and how destructive pure masculinity can be, when in reality we need to be more like Spike and be compassionate and try to understand. I mean, when he's faced with a guy who literally boils people and stacks their skulls into a pyramid, instead of being like, "You're crazy, I'm gonna shoot you," he's like, he tries to actually understand it and learns to, and even gives Eric a proper send-off, even though Eric was a jerk to him. I might be getting a little lost here, but all that to say is that I thought that not only the themes of war, but also the deconstruction and examination of what it means to be a man and what a man should do in this movie was fantastic. I would love to in the future do a much more structured deep dive of this subject in really media in general. All right, finally, the ending. So, as you know, the Go-Go Power Rangers ending is certainly controversial among people who have seen the movie. Whether you like the movie or not, you can agree that it's controversial. For me, it didn't ruin the whole movie like everyone said. If I were personally editing this movie, I would end it where he gets backed up against the wall, he draws the arrow, he lets it fly, and then we cut to black credits. That's personally what I would have done with it. But once again, I'm not an award-winning director, so what do I know? But, so the guy who shows up, right, he's meant to be Jimmy, the blonde kid from the beginning of the movie, which I kind of assumed was going to be Aaron Taylor Johnson's character, because at first I saw Spike was wearing a necklace, but then later we see that that necklace is not the same one. But reintroducing Jimmy right at the end is an interesting choice, and I understand from a structural sense why they wanted to do that. Obviously, he's going to play a big role in this next movie. I think right now the only reason I don't necessarily love this ending is because I don't see the plan for the next one. Obviously, they're going to make him sort of a cult-like figure, and this trauma from watching all of his friends, and I'm assuming family members as well, get murdered right in front of him has affected him, which is why everybody in his group wears blonde wigs and tracksuits similar to the Teletubbies, which he was watching when it happened. Obviously, it's all very intentional, and there is a plan there. I just haven't seen it yet, so I'm a little kind of like, okay, really, this ending hinges on whether or not the next movie sticks the landing or not, which might not be the best thing to say. You should be able to judge every movie on its own merit, but they shot them back to back. Another thing that I heard discussed is that Jimmy is meant to be somewhat based on a real life celebrity who was a rampant, horrible predator to women, men, children, and was just the scum of the earth and was sort of like a British celebrity for a time. And I think the idea is to show, and what I saw the director say is the idea is that this first one is about family, and it's meant to show you some of the good that's left in the world, and the next one is going to be about the depravity, the horrible things that would go on if society went unchecked like this. And we get a bit of foreshadowing when Spike's father mentions that the people on the mainland are strange and odd, or something along those lines. And we also see sort of biblical type graffiti that also has Jimmy's name next to it earlier on in the movie, which I didn't put that together in the theater, but I certainly did afterwards. So, like I said, clearly it's intentional. There is a plan here. I'm certainly worried for Spike's well-being, since he has encountered someone based on a real-life predator who has a cult full of Teletubbies that can murder the infected, like, just like that. So, yeah. But overall, I'm very, very interested in seeing where this goes. I think despite the ending, I still loved the experience of seeing this as an experience in the theater. I think it was fantastic. I don't really have many complaints with it. I think it's a very airtight story. I mean, there are a few things, like opinion-wise, that I don't love. I think slowing down the pacing is not the best choice for this movie, but I get they wanted to go for a more heartfelt and contemplative type story, and I think in the end it worked. That's just more of an opinion thing. But overall, I really, really enjoyed the experience of it. And I think that's one of the most important things with a movie. I think that the experience of watching it in the theater needs to be considered, because there's plenty of great movies that aren't necessarily Oscar-worthy films, but they are well-made, fun, entertaining pieces of media. And also a refresher for those of you who don't know my rating system. When I rate things, if something is like a 5 out of 10, that just means it's okay. 5 is my middle. 1 is it's horrible. 5 is it's just okay. 6 or 7 is it's above average. Think of it almost like grading levels when you get to 6 and 7. It's like C minus. And 8 would be a pretty good film. 9 would be great. And then 10 would be perfect. So I think for this movie, for 28 years later, I have to give it a very solid 8 out of 10. Let me know in the comments below what you thought of this movie. I know I really enjoyed it. And something cool I wanted to show off, at my theater, they were giving out these mini posters. And then on the back as well, there is... Oh, it's upside down. They gave us maps from the movie. These are close-up shots of it are shown within the movie. And so it's really cool to see this. And there's also, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a secret message in there. In the glare, you can see it says Memento Mori. I don't know if you guys can see that, but it says it in there, and I thought that was a really neat detail, and this is something I certainly want to get framed. So thank you so much for watching once again. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I hope you have a good morning or evening or, you know, whatever.